For more about 702,
go to primemediaplus.com.
So a major investigation report from the Sunday Times by Sabelo Skiti alleges that the road accident fund spent tens of millions more than necessary on a call center contract and did so outside of normal procurement processes. And this is a call center that used to cost about 25 million rand a year, and they decided to spend 199 million rand over 13 months. Sabelo Skiti, the investigative reporter at the Sunday Times, who's been running this story, joins us now on the show. Sabelo, good morning. Thank you so much for your time.
Good morning, Kgomotso, and thank you for having me.
Maybe let's just start with the genesis of this investigation, because this is part of wider work or wider body of work that's being done around the RAF. But how did the investigation, particularly into the call center, begin?
Yeah. So my colleague and I, in fact, he's done the bulk of the investigations into what has been happening at the RAF. And I think because of, the sort of interest that we as a newspaper and the publication had taken, because we basically wanted to unravel and look and see what it is that, has been happening at the RAF. You'd remember that this for us starts at the point where Collins Letswalo, as CEO of the RAF, gets into a tiff with the Auditor General. And the tiff, he refuses to back down on, this is now a couple of years ago, he refuses to back down from this tiff. It involves the ministers at some point because he doesn't want to be audited in the normal way that, the normal accounting standards that not even South Africa but the world prefers. He wants to, be audited in a different way. And of course, we now know through the SCOPA hearings that was all a way to mask what I would call incredible looting and malfeasance at the RAF. Now that SCOPA is beginning to unravel, some experts are talking about a deficit or a liability that has gone up to 500 million rand. And remember, the RAF is a contingent liability for the state in return. So it means that if the RAF can't put up that 500 billion rand that it's required to pay out in terms of these claims, it means that the state must come in, so that's where we started looking into it. And I think as we were going, we're beginning to find more and more out. And I think for me, this was particularly interesting because again, this is a situation where we've seen all too often in South Africa. A CEO comes into an organization, everything is functioning well. He then sees a need to start tinkering with things that don't need tinkering, at least according to what has been reported in the annual financials before and what people are saying internally. You find a call center that's operating at about 90 or so % resolution rate, which is actually quite good. I mean, even if you speak to corporate companies, if they can have that sort of resolution rate through one of their communication channels, it's amazing. Then you start tinkering with it, right? And then in the end, you find a situation where now the cost of this entire thing have grown tremendously, almost tenfold. In fact, when they do after that 190 million rand 13-month contract, the next contract was, the extension was in the region of about 300 million, So it comes at a great cost to the RAF. The people that are inside, of course, are saying that it's impossible for anyone to make a determination whether there has been an improvement or not, from when this thing was operated internally to when they have an external service provider.
And what happened in this particular instance? So how was this call center operating? I mean, it does seem that they were spending a lot less on it. Was it getting the job done?
Yeah, look, so that I think for me was one of the key things that I needed to determine, and it needed to be quite an independent thing. So I then went back to previous annual financial statements that the RAF had been putting out. And one of the things that, sort of helped convince me that I can rely on the information is that not only did the RAF do its own sort of, quality assurance on the operations of the call center, but they also had an independent, person come in and actually do the checking themselves. And as a result of that, that call center, yes, at the time that Collins Letswalo comes into RAF, it had experienced a bit of a decline from, like I said, a resolution rate of about 93, 94%. This was in 2018, 2019, to about late 80s. At the time that Collins comes in. So, it was performing adequately. And I think one of the key things around the difference now and then, a lot of the people that we've spoken to are saying is that the people that manned it before were people that were familiar. They were employees, RAF employees. So they were familiar with, how things work. And they could actually advise people who call into the call center adequately because they knew, where things were. And I suppose the only thing that you needed there, and they also admit this, is that there wasn't a technological integration, in how the system worked. So the only thing that they had wanted, I think the guy who ran the call center at the time had wanted to do was to say, I now want a thing where if I get a reference number, I can in real time open up and tell a person exactly where, the claim is. If someone has picked it up today, I can tell them that it's now been opened by a specific person, and in terms of the process, this is what must happen next. So they had something that was similar to that, but was not real time because it wasn't integrated into, and also I think the documents were not properly digitized for you to be able to do that. But this is something that the RAF could have done internally. In fact, that manager wanted to do it internally. But his suggestion was not approved by the EXCO, and instead they chose this very expensive way.
And from your investigation, how did you verify? Because you claim that procurement practices were flouted, right? So there was no competitive bidding. How did you verify this? How did you confirm that?
Yeah. So I think as a part of this, Kgomotso, we basically got a hold of some internal documents that gave us an idea of what sort of process was followed. So I'll talk you through a couple of those just now. So the first one is essentially a letter that had been written by Letswalo in his capacity as accounting officer at RAF. This was in November 2022. He writes this letter to the DG at the time in the Department of Labor, Utobile Lamati, basically saying, to them that they had begun a process of wanting to do a customer relation management, contract, and they saw that the one that had been concluded between this company, Alteram, and the Department of Labor, was the one that they had preferred, right? And they then needed permission to participate in that contract in terms of Treasury regulations. Now, Regulation 16.6A of Treasury regulations allows for a government department to sort of piggyback in a way on an existing state contract in order to avoid going out on the traditional, tendering system, issuing out an RFP and all of those things. This normally just allows for a bit of more efficiency in terms of getting the product, or service. But now Treasury always insists that if you are going to do that, then all the conditions must be the same. So if there's a year remaining on that contract, it means you can only participate only for the space of a year, and you can't change the amount, and you can't change any condition of that contract.
Yeah.
It's simply like a plug and play situation. So that's what they did. But then what I found quite interesting is that internally at RAF, there doesn't seem to have been any process that preceded this letter being written. In fact, when we look at the documents that we have, it looks like the procurement process at RAF only begins the following year, where you then get a department inside Letswalo's office recommending to Letswalo and writing a proposal with a business case that says that we think that we ought to revamp the call center. We need to bring in external expertise. We need to get a CRM. That's what they do. But if you look at the paperwork, the decision had already been taken. So it gives one an idea that they were actually doing what they were doing in January and Feb 2023 to try and mask the fact that and try and build a sort of process around, this process to give it an air of credibility. But they had already long taken that decision. And of course, what's critical for us as well is that in terms of RAF's own policies, that decision was a decision that ought to have been taken by the bid adjudicating committee and then escalated to the CEO for final approval. But in this case, even that process begins in the CEO's office and then goes back to the BAC and then goes back up to the CEO and to the board, which is very, very, very unusual. And I mean, to the point that when we started putting questions to the Road Accident Fund, they couldn't answer us adequately and referred us to some of the executives that were involved in the decision making. This includes the likes of Letswalo, the CFO, Bernice Potgieter, the head of office in Letswalo's office, Manyasha. Those were the people that were actively giving the approvals and doing the recommendation documents. And for some reason, it seems that none of these documents that underpin the need for this service can be found inside RAF. Those things are always red flags to sort of tell you that perhaps not everything is kosher about this deal.
All right, we're taking your calls on 011-883-0702 if you'd like to join the conversation. We're speaking about the Road Accident Fund and really what seems to be more shenanigans happening there. It's part of a greater body of work that's been done on the Road Accident Fund by the Sunday Times and other media houses, just as we've been seeing the details of what seems to be corruption and malfeasance unfolding before Parliament. We're also taking your WhatsApps on 072-702-1702. My guest is Sabelo Skiti, investigative reporter at Sunday Times. Sabelo, so how does this fit into the greater story of the RAF, the greater body of work? Because as you correctly say, this does point to some sort of malfeasance. And I think we're at the point now where we were thinking, how deep does the rot go at the RAF?
Yeah. So I think, Kgomotso, that's partly, the first part of it for us is to sort of get an understanding of just how deep does the rot go, right? Secondly, it also wishes to answer because, remember when Collins gets there, he gets there to a lot of fanfare, and almost immediately he starts this thing of making very political statements around, they need to overhaul how RAF works. At the time, RAF had just instituted a very successful program of saying that, if you need to claim from the RAF, you don't need to always use lawyers. You can just come to us.
Yes.
We've got the experts and stuff, we can actually process your claim. It will work much faster. So he stops things like that. He starts making claims about, cartels of lawyers that are milking the Road Accident Fund. He targets the medical aids. He almost looks like someone who wants to do a major overhaul and transform RAF into like this super efficient, entity. But then, of course, what we are now beginning to see is that he was sort of laying the groundwork for all of this malfeasance that we've seen. I said before, RAF liabilities have grown to about 500 billion rand. And this is by far the largest sort of risk to government, to the fiscus, basically. If you consider when Eskom was considered a problem, their debt was sitting in the region of about 400 billion rand. At that time, I believe RAF was sitting at about 180 or so, So RAF was one of the problematic institutions in that sense, but not really the institution. And I mean, if this 500 billion rand figure is confirmed, it will essentially take RAF right to the top of, the contingent liability that government has, which presents a real risk. So it's important for us to unearth. And again, for me, I think for holding people accountable, right?
Yeah.
So RAF is one of those institutions that if you don't watch closely, you can wake up to a problem such as the one that we have. So the way that they get allocated their funds come from the fuel levy. So every day you and I buy fuel at the gas station. a certain portion of that money gets allocated to the road accident fund, and for the fund to do what it does, basically ensure each and every one of us on the public roads, right? So that if there's anything that happens in terms of an accident, you can claim for medical expenses, you can claim for compensation, you can claim for loss of income in the case of your kids, should a person lose their life. So it's a very important institution, but it's an institution that, because of the nature of how the money comes in, it becomes very difficult for you to see whether there's waste and whether the institution is in trouble up until the burden gets too much. And I think this is probably where we are sitting now. We are sitting at a situation where, part of what I think Scopa will have to do is to look at whether RAF is still viable, as an insurance in its current form, or what else can actually happen. And those things are as a direct result of, allowing this sort of malfeasance to happen. We've seen this thing happen with some pension funds where they've been unable to actually honor what is due to the people when it becomes due to them, because over the years people have not been watching what has been happening there, and there's been great misuse and there's been great wastage and corruption.
Yeah. And I suppose now it's the what happens, right? I know that there's been suspensions that have been happening at the RAF. None of them seem to be directly linked to the malfeasance. Just clarify that. People are being suspended, but not necessarily linking them to what's happening there internally at the RAF.
Yeah, so I think, looking at it, Kgomotso, I think it's a matter of, you've got this interim board. They're there for a short time, led by the former Chief Procurement Officer, Kenneth Brown. That now has to come in and sort of, at the same time as Scopa is doing what it's doing, they've got to stabilize, the organization, make sure that they start then processes that would lead to a proper unraveling of what has actually happened inside there. And I suppose part of what we know as well from people that are internal at RAF is that the system that Collins had built was one that was built around intimidation, built around, people being punished if they stand up against what they perceive to be the wrong things. And I'm supposing that that's what they've come across now, is that with the presence of the executives there, probably people were still scared. So I think a lot of what that has to do with, of course, I understand that the board did find some malfeasance that they're looking into. But the important thing is that you also want to create an environment where people feel free from intimidation. People no longer feel scared. And the only way for you to do that is to then start that accountability. I think it's going to be interesting in the next couple of months what happens around how things get uncovered. And if there are indeed forensic investigations, we'll begin to see who was doing what, where, with who, and how. And I think that'll give us a bit of a better idea. And something that I also found quite interesting in the approach this time around from the interim board there is that they've also started referring some of these things to law enforcement agency for criminal investigation. Yeah. Because I think a lot of the times you'll find that organizations, new leadership comes in, they do forensic investigations. The forensic investigations find what they find, or they do become limited in terms of accessing, particularly when it comes to the gratification side of things. Because for you to be able to get access to, banking accounts of, executives and that sort of thing, it requires a bit more than just what you can do as, most, companies that do forensic investigations. Normally that just looks at the process and it's like a look at the paper and stuff like that. So I think what is interesting here is the fact that now they've brought in law enforcement. Of course, we do know that law enforcement will be able to go to banks and access bank accounts. They'll be able to access people's devices. And of course, the end result of a law investigative, investigation is that then people are charged. Which I think you and I will agree, and a lot of South Africans, is that something that happens far too less in these sort of situations.
Yeah. And what has the RAF been saying to your inquiries? I mean, are they commenting on this? What has their official comment been?
Yeah. So they did comment, I think, on the story in general, and I think they did try and provide us with as much information as they could. But what again stood out for me in this instance is that to some of the questions that we'd asked, they simply didn't know, because once these executives are not there, there doesn't seem to be any paper trail or any paper that shows that this is the process that underpinned a certain event or whatever. It's something that's very, very worrying. And I suppose it's also something for the RAF to then start considering and looking at whether then not to sort of extend charges against these individuals if there is no paper trail for some of their time, being executives there.
All right, Sabelo Skiti, investigative reporter at the Sunday Times. They're helping us make sense of the latest in the RAF saga. Really, I mean, there's just so much happening with the Road Accident Fund, and all the corruption just keeps on unraveling before Parliament, but also we're so grateful for the investigations that are happening in the newsrooms as well. People that are combing through the annual financial statements, people that are asking the right questions. And here we see another one of these dodgy deals, what seems to be a very dodgy deal to me. They're being exposed in the Sunday Times. Imagine having a call center that works, 25 million rand a year, and it works. And you find a reason, because you must find a reason to balloon that amount to 199 million rand, and you think that's okay.